I wanted to actually maybe steer it, James, to you mentioned like the physics and the modeling that you're doing, and I think that's something that deserves a deeper dive. The kind of grid of the future, which Tesla is pointing toward in their master plan, and which I think you and I mostly agree on. Would you maybe like try to lay out for everyone what does that grid look like, and why does it make the most kind of economic sense?
Yeah, so I started doing this analysis like back in 2000. I started building little models trying to understand like what the transition looks like. The most recent one I did was back in 2019, where I started rolling in Wright's law or learning curves associated with looking at the tech over the next couple of decades. There was a time when you could just look at how fast, what the trend line was of how much of what different kinds of capacity was getting added, try to figure out if it was a linear or an exponential and what the term was and sort of extrapolate forward that way. But now we have other tools that let us sort of predict these industries are mature enough that you can do a pretty good job of predicting like what it will cost to provide a particular service or a particular capability 5 or 10 years in the future. And so I wanted to start rolling that stuff in. So I started doing that stuff back in 2019 or something. And it has seemed for a really long time. Like if you look at, should I explain what learning curves are? Do people know what learning curves are? So there's a funny thing about building complicated things in the world or providing complicated services in the world is that, I mean, it's unsurprising that we get better at doing stuff. Like the cost of doing any particular thing, it tends to go down over time the more that you do it because you get practice doing it. Like if you're a person, the first time you build a chair, it takes a certain amount of time and it costs you a certain amount. And the second, third, fourth, fifth chair, you get more clever about how you're doing it. You find cheaper kinds of wood, you get better tools, you just get faster and the costs come down. When you get a chair factory and you've got 10 people doing it, well, now you can organize the work in different ways. There's just like, as you scale up, there are all these things there that you can do to reduce the cost and effort that it takes. So unsurprisingly, everything that people make, every service that we provide has a tendency to decrease in cost the more we do it as a society, whether it's individuals or companies or whatever the deal is. So this concept is called a learning curve, and it has this very surprising property, which is when you look at systems that are kind of scaled up a bit, and you look at how they improve over time, they have this surprising characteristic, which is that you can look at how they've been improving over time. And it's actually a very good indicator of how they will improve in the future, going quite far into the future. And this relationship, it's been known since like the 1850s or something. A guy at Curtis Wright, whose name happened to be Wright, like back in the early 1900s, formalized this. Like he studied their manufacturing line to try to understand it. And he came up with this formulation, which is called Wright's law. It's just basically this observation that there's this log relationship between how much you've done something and how good you are at doing it. And a way of describing it is that, every time you've done, say, twice as much as you ever did before, you've built one chair, then you build two, then you build 4, 8, 16. Every time you've doubled the number of chairs you do, that you get a certain percentage of improvement between those. And the interesting thing is it tends to go with that doubling cycle. So for instance, if your second chair was 10% less than your first chair, then your fourth chair will be 10% less than your second, and your eighth will be 10% less than your fourth, and so on. Like each time you've doubled them. And yes, that's because you do the easy stuff first, and then the things you haven't done to improve it. So yeah, it's a diminishing returns kind of curve. But this learning rate thing, it does seem like broadly different technologies, products, services, or whatnot, they have a learning curve. You can figure out what it is, and it tends, assuming that you've just more or less got a free market and there's no weird, sort of tariffs that come into the play, or you don't have like the one factory in the world that makes some important thing blows up or whatever. If you don't have these weird outlier events, everything sort of moves smoothly. It ends up being pretty predictable. So you can predict 10 years from now what a solar panel is going to cost, or 10 years from now what a a windmill is going to cost for generating electricity, or a coal plant, or a nuclear power plant, or that. And it seems like this wouldn't work because the world is so complicated, right? And like when you build a car, like you can apply this to the Model 3. I mean, people have gone back and they studied Ford's Model T, right? And it perfectly follows this learning curve thing. Like it's one of those things that you learn in business school when you learn about the learning curve, that you go back to this classic implementation. For things that are scaling smoothly, you get this law. So the interesting thing, one of the interesting things about these learning curves is they exist and they actually work really well. They're quite reliable about predicting how technologies and industries and stuff evolve. And the second thing is like nobody uses them to make predictions, right? And in fact, one of the interesting things about that, Matt and I, when we briefly talked about the Tesla master plan thing, we were looking at Tesla, at how much Tesla was saying, well, this will happen or that will happen. And we're like, some of this stuff like doesn't make sense. And I realized when I went back and I looked at the math that they don't have any learning curves in there, right? They assume everything costs the same as it does today to a first approximation. So why do you do that, right? Why did they do that? The thing is, if you assume that there's going to be a learning curve and there's somebody on the other side of the argument who one's going to argue against you, the first thing they're going to go after is your learning curve calculation, because learning curves are the kind of thing where they do work, but they're empirical laws. That there's no fundamental physical thing that you can derive from fundamentals that says this is what it's going to be. It's definitely going to follow this. It's an observed property of these big complicated systems. And we don't really understand exactly why it works. It does work, but we don't understand it. And so if you propose a learning curve to somebody who wants to push back on your argument, they will attack your learning curve, right? And so generally, if you want to make an argument and you don't want to have to fight over it, you just don't assume any learning curve, right? Because that removes a point that can be. But the thing is, if what you want to know is what the world is really going to look like, you have to look at the learning curve, because in some cases, the learning curve completely dominates every other thing that's going on. And this is like I would argue that back in the 90s, you could look forward to today and you can more or less predict where we are. Like it wouldn't have been that hard. And one of the things you could have predicted back in the 90s is it's all going to be solar power. It's all going to be solar power. I mean, there's going to be other stuff. There'll be places where, you have a dam, use the dam, or you have hydro, use the hydro, or the geothermal, you're going to use this stuff, right? But to a first approximation, solar is going to be so much cheaper than everything else that only in situations where you just can't use solar, like there's some reason why you just can't use it. Those are the only situations where you're really going to be using much of anything else. And why does this happen? Because if you look at the learning curve of solar, it's 28%, which is really, really steep. That wind power has a pretty steep curve, but it's 15%. Now, so coal has a learning curve, it's 2%, right? So coal, the learning curve on coal is really terrible. And on nuclear, it's like negative something percent, like 2, 3, 4, something like that, if you look at the numbers. So it's complicated. We are getting better at building nuclear power plants. But the thing is, our expectation of what constitutes a nuclear power plant is constantly shifting. We require them to be safer and safer. And so that's why they get more and more expensive, because we require them to be safer. And the way that we ensure safety is we have a giant bureaucracy with lots of things involved that ensures that safety, because it's a really important thing. And every year that bureaucracy grows by a predictable amount, right? So nuclear power plants get more and more expensive over time. They have a negative learning curve. The technology gets better, but it turns out that these other things that are actually more important than the technology as inputs to the price, they get worse over time, or at least they have to date. I know there are people who want to break that, and it's not like it's not possible to break it, but that's been the history up to now. So you could have looked at this decades ago and predicted the future pretty well. And I'm fascinated by the fact that you could do that. And so it's been a hobby of mine, tracking this and watching it go.
And so to try and sort of encapsulate, so what you're saying is that if you take into account this learning curve equation, and if we put it within the put it against what Tesla Master Plan 3 is saying the future is going to look like, the learning curve is painting a far better picture for the transition than the plan does. Is that a good way of characterizing what you said? Okay.
So I'll give you one example here. So I think this is relatively easy to explain. So solar and batteries, they both have, I mean, the way you measure learning rates varies and they're a little noisy. So people disagree about the numbers. But to a first approximation, people agree that solar and batteries are both around 25% learning rate, right? So all of the things being equal, like if the doubling time for both of them was about the same, you'd expect them to maintain their same cost ratio. So when you build out a grid, solar is intermittent. And the way you fix the intermittency is you have batteries. They store excess solar when you have excess, and they give you back that solar energy when you're running a little on the low side. Like, for instance, your batteries can charge up during the day and they discharge at night because you've got more solar during the day than you have at night. So batteries are how you fix that. So what's the optimum? How many batteries do you want and how much solar do you need in order to supply a system, a country, a state, a business? Well, you look at the total amount of it. At a minimum, you have to generate as much solar over the course of a year as you use over the course of a year. And actually, you're going to need to generate more than that because you're never going to get a perfect match between the batteries and the solar. So you have a little bit of extra that you do, but generally, because it goes up and down over time, and you get variance not just during the day but seasonally and so forth. One of the things you do is you either build more batteries than you need or you build more solar than you need, right? Because if you have, for instance, if you have many times more solar generation, if you have 5 times the solar generation that you need, the number of times when you don't have enough solar to do the job gets smaller and smaller. And so you don't need as much batteries to cover that hole. The flip side is the less over generation you have, the more you need in batteries. Well, batteries are more expensive than solar is. So when you try to figure out, well, what's the cheapest system that gets me good coverage, there's some ratio between batteries and solar. And the main driver of that ratio is how much do they cost relative to one another. Like if one of them is a lot more expensive, you want to overbuild the cheap one, right? All other things being equal, you get the same capability for less. So in Tesla's predictions right now, they're basically looking at the current price of batteries, looking at the current price of solar, assuming it's going to be the same in 2035. Literally, you can look at the numbers. I was shocked, but they're modeling no improvement in the cost of either of these two things. Now, to a first approximation, you might say, well, batteries and solar, they have the same learning curve. That's okay, right? Except the thing is, so these are some numbers I did back in 2019. I figured, that the world needed 50 terawatts of nameplate solar to like cover everything, and we needed 240 terawatt hours of batteries. Just, sort of top line numbers, not precise. So the thing is, the world, that means that to get there, we have to build 200 times as much solar as we have built up to date. So that's 8 doublings, right? That is, so we get to apply that 28% improvement in cost like 8 times over the volume of batteries that we're going to create. And the result is that, if the current cost of batteries, the current cost of solar is like 50 cents a watt or something like that. And so over that entire 10, terawatt build out, the average price that you would pay is like 19 cents because, it changes over time. And then you add all those together, you take the average price and it ends up being 19 cents. Right. So that's, it's a reduction in price of like a factor of 3 or something, but batteries. So for batteries, we need, now assume they're both built out over roughly the same time span, right? As we built the thing out. So for batteries, we need 4,800 times as much batteries as we have built to date. So that's 13 doublings. It's not 8 doublings, right? And what that means is the average price of those batteries to do the whole build out is 20 times less than what you were paying right now. So that is, if you look at the cost of this whole system over that window, what does it cost to build it out? The cost of the batteries is going to fall 10 times relative. The average cost of the batteries is going to fall 10 times relative to the average cost of the solar, and the solar is falling really fast, right? So the thing is, to a first approximation, you can like look at the world and say the batteries are just going to be stupidly cheap compared to how they are. And what does that say, right? What it says is that if you try to predict how the world is actually going to look, you need to assume that the batteries are way cheaper, like 20x cheaper than they are today. And that's how you're going to build it out. And what that means is that you're going to use batteries for all your storage, and you're going to end up building less solar than you would have otherwise, because relatively speaking, the batteries get cheaper relative to the solar than the solar does, even though the solar comes down a lot in price.